A question I had for all of you, and I think some of you touched on this in your presentations, but all of your presentations really had me thinking about researcher positionality, about how some of us are outsiders to the communities that we study. Some of us are insiders, we share identity or experience with our participants. And some of us maybe are like in-betweeners. You're both the researcher and the researched, or you share some things in common, but not others. And there's lots of advantages and disadvantages to all of those positions. And so I wonder if you've been reflecting on this, about your position as researcher with the various topics that you study, and if you have any reflections that you'd like to share. Of course.
All right, yeah, that's a really good question. And something I usually like to include in my presentations, but I was very short on time. There was a lot I wanted to share with you all. My positionality as a white settler, queer, non-binary person who is also neurodivergent, and who also uses cannabis, really impacted my involvement with the study. As being someone who also is actually eligible with the eligibility criteria, that's a great thing, but it's also, you have to be careful because I don't want to enforce my own experiences or superimpose that onto participants. I want to really make sure that they're taking interviews and discussions where they want. So it's really great in terms of especially our youth advisory committee. It feels like a community because we are all trans, non-binary, use substances. But yeah, it's just being really careful about not superimposing your own lived experiences onto those that you're interviewing.
Does anyone else have anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I am part of my research community. I would say that I feel more of an outsider still in the researcher community versus this community. Something I really struggle with is how I am representing essentially the struggles. I mean, we see in the research, and I've also seen in my experience, there's this high degree of suicidality in this community, and sometimes it's difficult to talk about these things. And I don't always want to emphasize that because I see so many papers who associate either autism or gender and sexual diversity with suicidality and just kind of leave it at that. Of course you want to die. And it can be challenging to engage with that research and to challenge it as well, to be no, it's not, and of course, actually, this is caused by stigma that is impacting people at every level of their lives. It's sort of inherent to the identity. And in that way, it can be challenging to balance how are we emphasizing these really important issues, but how are we also making sure that when I'm speaking to other people in the community who are my community, that I'm not just telling them you're going to die, because that's not true. I hope people do that.
Any other reflections on this one?
Yeah, I think I would put myself in that in between category for sure. I think that on the one hand, it does help, I think, to have some aspects of lived experience right in the research. But then I think, yeah, I really identified with Christian, what you said, not superimposing my own experiences onto the research, and really taking the opportunities to listen to folks in the community and understand what's important to people. And then at the same time, I think something that might be applicable for all of us and people doing research that they're close to is I think the importance of taking care of yourself in this research, and being mindful of that kind of overlap between your life and the work that you're doing.
I have two questions for two different panelists. Can I ask them both?
I think so.
Oh, amazing. Okay, so my first question, so I just want to make sure I get things right. Mika, at the end of your presentation, you mentioned physical space as in being important to equitable access. And I wondered if you could just explain what you meant by that more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think during the pandemic, we all know lots of spaces to shut down, and for some people virtual spaces aren't really accessible and aren't comfortable, or maybe don't feel safe. And so I think that was one of the things that we saw was that certain groups of people engaged less, with Shauna, for instance, we weren't able to do interviews in person. And so seeing some of the fallout, we can kind of theoretically attribute that to the lack of physical spaces and being able to see people in person. So yeah, so I guess just kind of like the idea that like some people are definitely more comfortable. You know, there's always a trade-off too. I mean, physical spaces can be more difficult to get to, and there are different kinds of barriers associated with that. But yeah, I think it's just definitely one of those things that we saw in the pandemic. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just curious. And then my other question was Christian. Yes, I was wondering if you had any sort of public health recommendations coming out of your research.
Yeah, definitely will be like a large chapter of my thesis, which is currently trying to get written. But yes, no, I think that's a really good question. I think when it comes to cannabis use, it's really important that we highlight these sorts of experiences, these really nuanced experiences that youth are describing when it comes to cannabis, because it highlights how important it is to seek out more harm reduction, harm reduction ways of responding to cannabis use rather than just abstinence. It's very clear that youth, especially trans and gender nonconforming youth, are using cannabis in really nuanced ways that we're still learning about. So like harm reduction approaches to cannabis use is a really big one that comes to mind. Yeah.
How were people recruited to Shauna, your study? I expect your population of interest may be difficult to reach or may not always be comfortable self-identifying.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for the question. So the way that Shauna recruits people is attempted through like community-based methods. So some of that happens through community organizations, through clinics. Like we have the Oak Tree Clinic in Vancouver, which is like the only clinic, I believe in Canada, that specifically is designed for women and children living with HIV. So a number of participants are recruited through there. It is an open study, so recruitment is always ongoing. But I think that part of in terms of like the population being sort of like difficult to reach or less likely to engage with research, I think that's really important, and I think speaks to like the importance of community-based methods. And so I think Shauna's done a lot of work prior to me, like coming onto the scene, like many years ahead, of like building relationships with people in community, women living with HIV, as well as like the organizations, providers that they see. And I think that really helps people feel comfortable and safe in engaging in the research. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you encountered participants who were skeptical of research due to being over-researched, not seeing real change happen after they share vulnerable personal things. Also, if you or your participants have ever struggled with wondering if the research would actually benefit people in meaningful ways rather than being just for academia, like how to translate and relate that research into actual action, policy changes, and seeing change.
I want to see change right now. Like the whole purpose of my thesis was like, this has not been researched in Canada, specifically looking at non-binary people. The only specific study is in Scotland. So now we got two. And like I found that to make policy changes, people in power want to see numbers first. I'm like, oh, like you hear it's a problem, but how big is the problem? Like now I can show them like it's a big problem. So now I want to make policy changes as soon as we can and start getting like even just like one person behind it and starting the domino effect. And I really hope that that's what comes of this project with TransConnect, of making our report and our infographics, that even just like one person who's on a team sees the stat and thinks like, oh, hey, maybe like saying that isn't okay, and like starting to tip that.
I also do want to add on to what Martha has been saying. Just like at least when I was kind of doing my literature review and looking at the existing literature, there's also just not a lot of talking being done within the academic and scholarly circle about like the health issues that at least the cohort I focused on, women living with HIV. So it's like, how can change be conducted if we aren't even looking
in those spaces to begin with, or making meaningful collaborations or like meaningful discussions with these communities. So like it kind of is like taking those steps to first start off with the research and like talking to people, and like once you have those meaningful conversations, making those policy changes.
And did anyone experience participant reluctance where folks maybe were suspicious of the research apparatus and hesitant to get involved?
This is why I highlighted my experience with Amplify, because I had the opportunity of facilitating art with a group who certainly some of them seemed a little apprehensive, but as soon as they got to drawing and creating, you could really see the mood shift and the trust established. And I think that's a great strength of arts-based research tools.
Are there other questions in the room? Please.
First of all, great presentations, everybody. I'm interested in the questions. There's been a little bit of talk so far about knowledge to action. And what are some innovative ways aside from the usual academic channels, which we need, of papers and conferences? How have you been linking with your YACs or your community advisory committees to share your findings?
I can start if that's okay. Yeah, that's a really great question. It's super important, and ties into the previous question. I think it's so important that this research is grounded in community and always brought back to community, for and by community. And that's of course what we're doing with our youth advisory committee. But in doing things like, for example, a lot of the photos that you saw on the screen today will be featured at an in-person photo exhibit at some point in the fall. And that will be a space dedicated to community. And of course, academics are welcome, but I think framing it as a space that is for community, to learn from each other's experiences and to connect is really key, at least from my experience.
Like a limitation is that on a CV, people want to see you in conferences and publishing a lot. And like if you show up on a podcast, you're like, okay, great, but like what does that count for? But like that's how people are going to find out the information and like really absorb it when you're sitting in traffic. Like, so I think there needs to be a bit of a shift in the academia world to like accept these other forms as like really valid and sometimes like the most critical point of getting our points across.
I just wanted to add on to that. I think for my research, specifically, like I think, and it probably applies to a lot of people here, I think that the people that are being researched already kind of like, they know these things, so their experiences. And so what we're doing is like packaging them in a way that can be like absorbed, digested by like the people in positions of power. And so I 100% agree. I think that like the knowledge mobilization piece is so important. Yeah, I think for Shauna and my project, I think we're going to talk about doing again kind of like an infographic. I know previously like they've done videos to kind of like put this information into like a way that like maybe a clinician will see and then be able to kind of like implement or at least start thinking about like, how do I show up? How do I respond to trauma? What's my own trauma? And kind of like get them to start thinking in like maybe a slightly different way. But yeah, it's definitely important.
We probably have time for one more quick one, so we'll turn back to the virtual space. We've got a couple of minutes.
We've got 3. Okay, I'll just
We don't
go.
have time for 3.
No, I'll go in chronological order. I'll go for a question for everyone. So
Perfect.
yeah. Given that so many of the implications of your study discuss the structural issues that your cohorts and participant demographics face, what are your strategies to push for policy reform to provide a safer environment for yourself and your participants?
I see that as two separate things, like the safety for us and the safety for the participants. Like being at non-binary in academia is like a whole thing in and of itself. And like having these spaces is important. And like being up here with non-cis people is like really amazing. So like that needs to improve a bit, making academia more inclusive for everyone. And like people with lived experience have such good research. So making sure that they're safe in these environments is really important. And what was the other part of the question?
How to make it safer for your participants as well.
like ours was a survey, so making sure like we have a little warnings of like, this is coming up. If you don't want to answer it, you can skip the whole thing, or like you can always leave, and ways people can just get out of the survey easily. But yeah, like you were saying, like our participants know this information, like non-binary people in sport know it's not good. It's it's cis people who need to kind of see that now. So not being like giving our data only back to those who gave it already, like they know what's up. So showing it to other people is the most important for me.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add is kind of like what you touched on, AJ, at the very beginning is like, being mindful and like talking about like the fact that academia is like a colonial system, and like to constantly be interrogating that in like the work that we do and then also within ourselves. I think it's really important. So like I really appreciate that that's coming out of open space. Yeah,
That's a lovely way maybe to go get to close this. So I'll invite you all to stay, and I'd like us to give another round of applause to our incredible panel.